Welcome. If you're looking for a place to unwind, to let your mind drift, and to fall asleep to the sound of old stories, you're in the right place. Here, we explore the legends of Blizzard. Tonight, we begin a new chapter in the Warcraft saga. An army rebuilt from the ashes of victory. A war chief who took power not through sorcery or shadows, but through strength alone. And a war machine assembled from the most unlikely of allies. Trolls, goblins and giants. That would soon come crashing against the kingdoms of the north. So get comfortable. Close your eyes, and if this helps you rest, or just brings you peace, consider subscribing for more quiet journeys through Warcraft history. Now, let the story begin. The Horde had won, Stormwind had fallen. The human kingdom that had held the southern lands of the eastern kingdoms for generations lay in ruin. Its walls breached, its king dead, its people scattered north by sea. By any measure, the first war had been a complete Horde victory. And yet the orcs who marched through those broken gates were not the people they had once been. The demonic corruption running through their blood, Manaroth's blood, drunk willingly in ceremony on Draenor, had been burning through them for years. It made them powerful. It made them savage. It made them capable of feats of war that no organised human force could match in open battle. But it was also consuming them. The rage that drove them was not sustainable. Orc society, which had once been organised around clans and shamanic tradition and a deep respect for the spirits of the land, had collapsed into something much darker. A war culture sustained by corruption and organised from the shadows, by men the average orc soldier never saw. What the Horde needed, after the fall of Stormwind, was a leader who understood all of that. What it had instead was Blackhand. Blackhand the Destroyer had been war chief since before the portal opened. Physically imposing, brutally effective in battle, and exactly the kind of figure whose presence in a war camp inspired confidence. He was the face of Horde power, the war chief who roared commands and tore through enemies with his bare hands if needed. But behind that face, Gul'dan's Shadow Council was running everything. The Council, a secret body of orc warlocks who had been Gul'dan's instrument since before the corruption of the clans, controlled the Horde's strategy, its timing, its resources, and its direction. Blackhand was their chosen figurehead, selected not for wisdom or vision, but because he was manageable. He knew his position was owed to the Council's favour, and he was smart enough not to test the limits of that arrangement too aggressively. For a time, this worked. The first war had been won. The Horde was celebrating. The orcs who might have asked difficult questions were busy dividing the spoils of a ruined kingdom. But one orc had been paying attention. Orgrim Doomhammer was the chieftain of the Blackrock clan and the bearer of a weapon that had been in his bloodline for generations. The Doomhammer itself, an ancient and storied warhammer that lent its name to its wielder. He was not a loud man. He did not perform his ambitions. He was, however, one of the finest warriors the Horde had ever produced, and he had grown up alongside Blackhand, which meant he had watched the man closely for long enough to understand exactly what kind of war chief he was, and exactly who was pulling his strings. Doomhammer had pieced it together slowly, through observation and careful questioning, and the kind of patience that most orcs, burning with corrupted blood, could no longer manage. What he found confirmed what he suspected. The Shadow Council was real. Its control over the Horde was real. And the war the orcs had just won had been fought on behalf of demons and warlocks, not for themselves. He decided to do something about it. The challenge was issued in the old way, Makgora, a duel to the death before the assembled clan leaders, legitimate under Orcish tradition, and impossible to refuse without losing face entirely. Doomhammer stepped forward and named Blackhand as a puppet, a figurehead for hidden masters who had stolen the Horde's dignity and sold its strength to forces no orc had ever consented to serve. Blackhand accepted the challenge. He had no choice. The fight did not last long. Whatever Blackhand was, and he was a dangerous opponent, Orgrim Doomhammer was something else entirely. The Doomhammer rose and fell. Blackhand did not rise. Doomhammer looked out at the gathered chieftains and warriors and claimed the title of war chief. And then, almost immediately, he turned his attention to the council. Gul'dan had not anticipated losing his puppet this quickly. The purge was swift and merciless. Shadow Council members, accustomed to operating from protected shadows under Blackhand's arrangement, found those shadows stripped away. One by one they were hunted and killed. Warlocks who had considered themselves untouchable for years, gone within days of Blackhand's death. Gul'dan survived by offering something Doomhammer could not ignore: information. The location of the tomb of Sargeras, a vault of ancient and terrible power that the demon lord Kil'jaeden had once promised Gul'dan as his ultimate reward. Doomhammer had no interest in the tomb itself, but he understood the value of a powerful warlock on a very short leash. He spared Gul'dan. He made the terms of that arrangement clear. Gul'dan accepted. He was patient. He had waited this long. With the council neutralised and his own position secure, Doomhammer turned to the question of the coming war. The human kingdoms of the north, Lordaeron, Stromgarde, Dalaran, Kul Tiras, had heard what happened to Stormwind. Anduin Lothar was there, raising an alliance. The second war would not be fought against a single isolated kingdom. It would be fought against a coalition. The Horde needed allies of its own. Doomhammer looked east toward the ancient forests that ran along the coast, and to the forest trolls of the Amani tribe. The Amani were one of the oldest peoples on Azeroth, descended from the great Zul-Aman Empire that had once dominated much of the continent. They had never forgotten what the High Elves of Quel'Thalas had done to them. The wars that had broken their empire, the treaty the elves had struck with the early human kingdoms that had permanently shifted the balance of power against them. The wound was ancient, the anger was not. Doomhammer offered revenge. He promised that the war would sweep through Quel'Thalas, that the High Elves would pay for what their ancestors had done. The Amani accepted. Their headhunters and berserkers joined the Horde's ranks, adding a ferocity and knowledge of forest terrain that the Orc army had lacked. The goblins required a different kind of persuasion entirely. The goblins of Khazan had no ancient grievances to settle. They were engineers, merchants, and profiteers who had built an entire civilization around the principle that someone else's war was always an opportunity. Doomhammer offered them contracts and a share of the spoils. In exchange, the goblins brought something the Horde had desperately needed since the beginning: technology. Goblin sappers, small, fast, and demonstrably unconcerned with their own continued survival, could deliver explosive payloads to fortified walls that conventional siege had no answer to. Goblin zeppelins gave the Horde an aerial capability. Goblin engineers could build and break things faster than any orc could manage. It was a transaction conducted between parties who understood each other perfectly. Both sides were satisfied. And then there were the ogres. Ogres had marched with the Horde since the First War. Massive, nearly impossible to bring down, and useful in the way that a battering ram is useful. Doomhammer oversaw the transport of additional ogre warriors from Draenor through the Dark Portal, adding their raw power to a military that was already beginning to look like something qualitatively different from the invasion force that had sacked Stormwind. Among those ogres came a surprise. Some had developed arcane ability, rare, unpredictable, two-headed ogre magi, whose chaotic magical capacity added a dimension to the Horde's arsenal that no one had planned for. You did not direct an ogre mage so much as aim it and hope. What Doomhammer had assembled, as the Second War approached, was a military that deserved to be taken seriously on every level. Orc grunts, hardened veterans organised by clan, wolf riders providing speed and raiding reach, troll headhunters moving through forest terrain that human soldiers couldn't navigate, goblin sappers solving fortification problems, ogres absorbing punishment that would have stopped any lighter force, and moving through all of it in a different register entirely, the Death Knights. Gul'dan's most terrible creation from his Shadow Council days, the souls of orc warlocks stripped from dying bodies and bound into the reanimated corpses of fallen human knights. Armoured, relentless, wielding a dark fusion of orcish sorcery and the physical power of a human warrior's frame, neither living nor fully dead. They were the Shadow Council's final gift to the war effort. Now they answered to Doomhammer. The alliance that Anduin Lothar was building in the north would face all of this. They would face a horde that had learned from the First War, led by a war chief who had earned his title in blood rather than politics, and backed by allies drawn in from every corner of the world's grievances and ambitions. Whether that would be enough to break the kingdoms of men was a question the Second War would answer. That story continues next time. If tonight's chapter helped carry you towards sleep, a like means more than you know. It helps other quiet travellers find their way here. And if you'd like to follow this war to its end, subscribe, and I'll be here for every chapter. Until then, sleep well, dream quietly, and good night.